The Pacific Northwest has a particular kind of beauty to it. The tall evergreen trees, the dreary fog contrasted with brilliant sunshine, the winding hills and distant mountains, it all creates an atmosphere that is beautifully scenic, but slightly uncanny. It is often so beautiful as to feel suspect, like there is a magic to it, some kind of hidden intensity that makes it hard to feel completely welcome within the landscape. So it's easy to imagine the Pacific Northwest and the Olympic Peninsula as being a gateway to alien encounters like in The X-Files, or full of vampires like in Twilight, or inhabited by little psychic ghost girls like in the American version of The Ring, or just all sorts of fucked up in general like the entire town of Bright Falls from the Alan Wake games. There is always a sense in these forests, especially out at night along the road when the fog beats back against the headlights, of being on the borderline between natural and supernatural, where the distinction between them feels uncomfortably thin. Pacific Drive is a lot of things: a survival sim, a traversal challenge, a driving game, but what it is above all genre elements is a piece of art about that feeling of mystical possibility lurking around every curve of the road. Much more than a survival sim, it is an atmospheric landscape generator. The core gameplay loops provide reasons to go driving out into the woods again and again, but the mechanical structure is just a trellis on which the art can grow. What's really remarkable is that much of this is done on a roguelike basis using procedural generation. There are certain road templates, they become especially familiar over longer playthroughs, but the composition of what's along the roads and elements of their landscape are completely different every run. This is the fiction of the game as well. The year is 1998. Back in the 1950s, an experiment with new forms of energy created a dangerous instability in the fabric of reality on the coast of the Olympic Peninsula. The area was cordoned off as the Olympic Exclusion Zone. The boundaries grew twice, eating larger and larger chunks of Washington state. It's been stable for a while, until you, an intrepid and unnamed delivery driver, are pulled by an anomaly through the concrete barrier. You are lost until coming across a garage with a big old broken-down station wagon from the time when this region was engulfed by the zone. For you, it starts right up. And that is the beginning of a beautiful friendship between the player and this lumbering beast of old Detroit. The Olympic Exclusion Zone is a place in constant flux. Storms of anomalous energy break down and rebuild it constantly, making things disappear and reappear, remaking things. It is impossible to live there outside of pockets of stability. Nothing much works anymore, least of all a station wagon like that. The reason behind this is a hilarious kind of magic, already known to anyone who's caught the Ford fever for some kind of old shit-bucket car, where the machine is infused with a special energy that bonds it to its owner, making the owner obsessed with it, making them spend more and more time and effort on the object, called a remnant within the game, until they themselves are expended. It's such a wonderfully, playfully metatextual setup. It perfectly justifies the mechanical purpose of the station wagon, communicates the game's arc of progression, and satirizes the manic devotion most enthusiasts feel towards their automobiles, all in one dense little nugget. The setup just perfectly launches a player into the game ahead, buttressed by some tutorializing integrated into the main plot. The hours from there just roll on by, which can actually add up to quite a few hours. Pacific Drive is kind of unusual among games I played in that it can be a shorter game or a very long one. If you aren't trying to max out the tech tree and are willing to finish the game without the vehicle being completely decked out, it can last around 10 or 12 hours. Going deep, trying to experience everything, it can last around 50. That's what happened to me. But of course that's what happened to me because I'm exactly the kind of person the game is making fun of in the first place. Pacific Drive is especially wild to me because I own something like it in real life, a 1978 Ford Thunderbird with which I made a couple of travelogues a while back. This era of American cars has a lot of wonderful, bizarre peculiarities to them. They are extremely heavy but feel underpowered. They typically only have 3-speed transmissions and only really go fast if you upgrade the carburetor and tune the engine to compensate, which always comes at the cost of egregious gas mileage if you do. They have a floaty, boat-like driving feedback, going placidly over bumps with heavy coil shocks in a way that modern cars, even modern luxury cars, simply do not. They are simple and easy to work on, but with no computers, they are always decaying in asynchronous little ways, requiring a driver to track down a loose wire and jiggle it to restore function, or adjust the air-fuel mixture in the carburetor to get an even idle, or any number of small hands-on fixes that become second nature and familiar to the amateur mechanic over time. They are bloated, inefficient, and somehow extremely endearing for being that way. Pacific Drive takes every single one of those qualities and makes them tangible within the game mechanics, structuring the entire experience around an incredibly authentic simulation of what owning, operating, and maintaining an American land yacht feels like. This is not just my niche, this is my super annoying special interest that I will talk about incessantly, and I am absolutely blown away by the loving detail with which Ironwood Studios replicated the sensations and emotions of bonding with one of these old machines. If you loved Pacific Drive, I'll go so far as to say you might like the full experience of owning an antique car. The world has, unfortunately, moved past the era where these kinds of cars cost $500, but the kind of car you used to be able to get for $500 eerily resembles the remnant as you begin the game. Missing a lot of pieces, bad tires, rattly engine, the unpleasant smell of ranch dressing left in the sun a long time ago. To start from such a position and restore a machine to a better condition, stronger and shinier, well, that's the dream of it. In real life, it takes wads of money and hours of work to make progress on such a restoration. But Pacific Drive offers it for just the cost of playing the game, fictionalizing and simulating the experience in a way where the exact same emotional investments pay off in the exact same ways. Pacific Drive is not an especially easy survival sim. It will absolutely wreck your shit early and often in extremely variable and unpredictable ways. This is the friction that makes the experience feel so authentic. The one truth about automotive restoration that's basically immutable is that you have to really want it and not lose focus even though there's a million things conspiring against ever fixing the damn car. Usually it's trying to come up with cash. As a survival crafting title, Pacific Drive offers a much more fun alternative to cash by making materials shortages the obstacle to overcome. The more you learn about the zone, the better able you are to plan excursions to get just what you need. There is always an element of gambling, of risk and reward, because something going badly out on the road can set you back further than before starting out. This unpredictable, constantly shifting flux of what you encounter in the roguelike zones and how you as a player handle those challenges create the game's emotional ups and downs, the structure of play. Enjoying being on that roller coaster is what can inflate the game's playtime from 10 hours to 50. I did not play Pacific Drive for the plot, although I enjoyed the plot and the characters a great deal. I played it for the car. I played it for the process. And most of all, I played it for the mood. I have spent a great deal of my life chasing and trying to immerse myself in the sensation of what it's like to adventure out in the wilderness in a big old rusty machine. And here it is, a virtual impression of the whole experience that's so close as to be uncanny. Maybe that's what's startling to me about it. I primarily play video games to experience the thrill of being unfamiliar people in unfamiliar circumstances, and in Pacific Drive I was just playing as myself. The same self I am all the time, in the same part of the world, with the same desperate, insoluble obsession. Pacific Drive is not a racing game, but there is a race within it, between the player's curiosity and the game's ability to provide an experience that feels novel with the limited pieces it has to assemble itself with. Pacific Drive explains its mechanics well enough. There is a lot of tutorializing to get a player used to navigating the interface and how item crafting works and such, but what it doesn't explain at all is how to best pace yourself as you're going through it. In the first 20 or so hours I was playing the game, I was trying to explore every point of interest on the maps and scavenge everything I could. That's the point, right? It's a survival crafting game I need to craft and probably also to survive. The mistake of this approach is that some things become overfamiliar very quickly, and it extends the early game far past the point where it ought to start expanding into the new zones of the mid and late game. Pacific Drive's excursions into the zone should be, in some way, focused and intentional. It's best when you know what kind of resources you want and are able to go looking for them specifically. This keeps the emphasis on the driving, on exploration. Going through the game where every time there's something to stop at, you stop, hurts the pacing, and leads to absolutely absurd surpluses of certain materials. There are a lot of materials that are designed as choke points, slowing down progression until they can be found, but most materials exist in abundance within the environment so that you can get them as needed. You don't have to scavenge every broken down vehicle you pass on the road. You should only really be bothering with them if you're broken down and need to make a tire repair kit, or rooting through trunks for road flares because you're running low. It should be driven by need and not just by completionist compulsion. But that, unfortunately, is not part of the tutorial. The game will tell you how it works in a basic sense, but the ways to experience the game complexly and in the long term are oddly obtuse compared to other survival titles I've played. I fully realize now that I had been, for many hours, playing the game wrong by treating it as a game where resources would be rare. Most are not. And the ones that are, well, going after them in a proactive way is the structure of much of the gameplay. Pacific Drive, when in the groove, is astonishingly immersive and compelling, but figuring out what the groove is and how to get there can take so much longer than expected, with all the heavy lifting done by the player themselves. The player has to figure out what they want out of Pacific Drive in the first place, and then figure out how to get it. This friction is part of the fun, to be fair. It is an incredibly self-determined experience, which is an element of why the hours invested between one player and another can be so dramatically different. But the game can end up being a slower experience than I think it was intended to be. The procedural generation does not reward a completionist sensibility when you're out exploring. In fact, it kind of punishes it, because it is very easy to become very tired of the various building types that are procedurally added to the landscape and very overfamiliar with what they provide on a resource basis. The game is not meant to feel like a chore, but it can begin to come across that way without mixing it up enough, without following the main plot closely enough to unlock the new areas in a good amount of time. The way the game works, players must drive from the outer zone toward the older, stranger inner zones across multiple regions. So there is actually plenty of opportunity to explore the early areas even late into the game. Doing too much too early genuinely does, on balance, the whole thing. Following the main plot is the cure for this. It'll guide a player right on through those early stages, but then the problem is that soon after unlocking the ending zones, the narrative portion ends, and it ends in a way that feels satisfyingly climactic, ironically sapping motivation for continuing through to a post-game free-play experience. I love everything about Pacific Drive besides these pacing difficulties, and even then I can't tell if the pacing problems are essentially my fault for playing the game in a way that's contrary to expectations. As a game that's procedurally generated, though, it can't really present too deliberate or intentional of a progression pathway because it has to use the systems that it's created and their various interactions to create an average experience of play. It cannot account for outliers and extremes in how people will approach the game. By the time I figured out how to play Pacific Drive in the most satisfactory way, it was already half over. Part of that, of course, was a desire to progress up the tech tree as quickly as humanly possible and get my station wagon looking fly. There are hard limits on what you can do without getting into the mid-zone and deep-zone areas, but even the game's early research and crafting requirements are pretty steep and grindy. Even getting to those thresholds is quite a few hours of adventuring around. So I wanted to get the most out of every run, not really understanding how many runs there would ultimately be yet to come. Reflecting on it, though, I've come to realize that figuring out the rate of player advancement is one of the biggest developmental challenges in making a game like this. For the experience to feel authentic, for the sense of progression to really mean something, then the period of time where the car feels fragile and lethargic has to last quite a while. A key element of owning a car like this is being irritated with it. My process of becoming better as an amateur mechanic in real life was pretty much directly tied to whatever annoying, inefficient thing that a given machine was doing. Bad wiring? Better learn to read an electrical diagram, fucker. Engine stalling out under hard acceleration? Better figure out how a choke works and which screws adjust what. Taking automotive courses at a community college, I learned how to do the work in a formal, structured way that built on itself, but on my own, the learning is utterly haphazard and objective-oriented. It is so much fucking work to fix stuff sometimes, especially when figuring out how to fix it is part of the process. To simulate that sometimes obscene amount of friction is a challenge because it can't be rushed through. It would feel trivial if it was possible to make the car feel fast and strong right away. That's something that takes hours on hours of sweat, knuckles bloody, face gritty. It's this process of friction that bonds a person to the car in the first place. It's that blood sacrifice that really makes it yours. So the early upgrades make slow, incremental differences to performance and survivability without it seeming like it comes too easy or too simply. Because the Olympic exclusion zone will try so hard to fuck up the work you've done, and because it is so often very successful in doing so, the process of upgrading the station wagon is actually a process of suffering and determination, as God intended. It's fascinating to me how much of what is fun about automotive repair and how much of what sucks about automotive repair are basically the same things. It's hard and sometimes tedious, and often what you get out of it is very subtle. There are not very many tiers of upgrades in Pacific Drive, usually just about 4 to 6, but each car part goes along these upgrade paths: bumpers, doors, headlights, tires, body panels, tons of accessories and tools. So it's not so much that each upgrade is diluted in its usefulness, it's that cumulative change can only happen over long periods of play. By locking the upgrades that make the biggest changes in how the vehicle controls and the overall game feel behind the late-game resources, the game ensures that there is a minimum threshold of hours in activity where the wagon feels pretty fucking rough. Without establishing that baseline and establishing points of friction and fragility, there is no emotional significance to upgrading the car to the point where those frictions disappear, and the weaknesses are replaced by strengths. It's different with a car than it would be for an RPG protagonist getting better all the time, mechanically progressing. For a player character, the arc is narrative. It is a numerical expression of the process of growing and learning. The car does not do this. It is a dependent, incapable of doing anything on its own. The improvement, therefore, is a testament to the player's commitment, to their willingness to sweat and sacrifice on the machine's behalf. A player character's rise to power is the process that allows them to seize the prize, meet the challenge. The station wagon in Pacific Drive is the prize and the challenge. The dangers and mysteries of the world, these can only be overcome and unraveled as a team, as partners. Without the driver, the machine is inert. Without the machine, the driver is overexposed. The science fiction of the setting is really just a tool to draw out and intensify that odd, asymmetrical relationship between human and machine. For the same reason that significant upgrades to the car are designed to take a long time, the actual repairs are designed to take a short time. It's what's best for the simulation. The closer the game might get to the complexity of actual repair, the slower it would be to play. If it took 2 hours to swap a starter motor, then that would be the gameplay, not driving around and experiencing the landscape. So all of those processes are simplified and abbreviated down to the absolute shortest little windows of activity. And because of how fucked up the car gets, it still ends up taking a significant interval between runs to reset the wagon to adventuring condition. It is the maximum amount of time these things can take before it feels genuinely overcomplicated in terms of gameplay. All the car parts you mess around with are practical ones. The engine is just one unit, for example. You don't have to worry about an alternator breaking down at a different pace from the distributor, or ever having to readjust a valve. For true car sickos, this might be a disappointment, but most players are going to come at it without that background. So every part that a player has to worry about is a part with a tangible connection to the gameplay. All those body panels break down because the car is the point of impact for hundreds and eventually thousands of obstacles that slam into it. The gas tank is important to worry about because gas is part of the survival sim. Electricity too, so the battery can be upgraded. Headlights provide illumination in the extreme oppressive dark of the night, so they're an interactive component that can break down. The engine, as the powerhouse of the whole thing, is a concept that anyone can grasp. Any more complicated than that, and you'd have to be tutorializing about how an engine actually works, and not just what role it has in the gameplay. Tires make the most sense of all because they affect how it handles on the road surfaces you do spend the majority of your gameplay time on. My favorite variant tire is the puncture-proof ones. They alleviate the irritation of constantly stopping to inflate and patch flat tires, at the cost of making the thing drive like even more of a slippery brick. I didn't use them for the whole game. I got tired of that feeling eventually and was willing to put up with the vulnerability of rubber tires for the significance of their performance boost. All tangible things within the gameplay, all actionable items in terms of the broader survival simulation and its goals. It would be one thing to simply make a car mechanic simulator. Red Dot Studios has a game franchise that's literally that. But Pacific Drive is not that. The car repair aspects are just the foundation on which it builds the rest of its strange and beautiful world. The closest it gets to real car repair in the mechanics and not just the emotions and the themes is in the diagnosis station. As you explore, and particularly as you accidentally wander into dangerous anomalies, the station wagon acquires quirks, a large and randomized assortment of inconveniences where performing a car function like steering to the left or turning the windshield wipers on will erroneously trigger a different car function. As these build up, they can make the station wagon very difficult to control, so you need to use the diagnosis station to purge them. The way to do this is just by correctly identifying the problem as an if-then statement. Then you can use an appropriate repair kit and solve it. This process of deduction is the absolute heart of actual car repair, or at least the puzzle-like problem-solving aspect of it. Customer states their car lost power and died on the freeway, but first the radio stopped working and the headlights dimmed. If they lost power that way with no other symptoms, then the alternator was no longer charging the battery during operation, and therefore the alternator should be tested and replaced. If the engine is not firing and the battery is fine and the starter motor is fine, then it might be a fuel delivery issue and you ought to check if the fuel pump is working. Mechanical knowledge is knowing what the system needs to operate properly and deducing from the failure which subsystems are not contributing to the whole. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it is obnoxiously vague. This is the way the diagnosis mechanics work in Pacific Drive. It preserves the spirit of the process it's simulating while hugely abbreviating it down to what feels rewarding in a gameplay context. Pacific Drive won't teach you actual car repair, but it will communicate the methods and emotions of the process, which is kind of the ultimate goal of simulating anything, if you ask me. The station wagon exists on kind of an interesting spectrum between the landscape and the science fiction. The specific incident with limb technology and the ARDA research team is the lore of it, but the way the Zone and ARDA also kind of stand in for modernity and progress in general is the thematic heart. We cannot tame a landscape without scarring it permanently, without altering its nature into something different. The science fiction just kicks things up into a kind of heightened extreme version of these changes. The anomalies and the left-behind normal things like cabins, gas stations, and research trailers all end up blending into a kind of hallucinatory morass, a strange and artificial blight that makes the otherwise beautiful Olympic Peninsula weirder. Amid actual nature, the station wagon is just as bizarre an interloper as the floating junk piles and electrical fungus. There is no separation or contrast between the remnant and the absurd instabilities with basic reality. The contrast is between the world as it ought to be in a natural state and all the unintended consequences of what we do as humans to make the landscape more comfortable. It's an artistic flourish that Death Stranding also went out of its way to underline. In that game, the highways are like ghosts, lost in time, pulled from the ether to float above the landscape just as often as they flow across it. In both games, the presence of the road is treated as miraculous and aberrant, a kind of amazing improbability. In Pacific Drive, as the player gets deeper into the zone, the dominance of anomaly over nature becomes more pronounced. In the outer zone, things are still relatively normal for Washington State. Tall trees, deep shadows, soft grasses. The mid-zone, however, is a toxic swamp. It is by far the most dangerous, aggressive territory in the game, much more so than even the deep zone. The problem is the corrosive storms. Acid is the basis of most of the anomalies in this region, and the sheer number of explosive blobs lurking around every corner and raining down from the sky can eat away your body panels in moments. In the early zones, the main dangers are radiation and electricity. There are further modifiers to each region that can cause serious problems, like electrical current causing the car to surge forward at dangerous speeds. When the surge flings you into a telephone pole or a boulder, it can cause significant damage. While I often got pretty beat up in the outer zones, the mid-zone regularly destroyed big portions of my car by the time I was done doing a run. I eventually figured out how to get around without too much danger, but learning the region was a process that absolutely kicked my ass. More than being mechanically difficult, the mid-zone is a landscape that is obviously degraded. What was verdant is now withering, what was clean has gone sour. The resources now include some very exotic and strange materials that are blends of the natural and unnatural. Trees with strange sap from which a player can make hardened plates, condensed crystals that can power new accessories and headlights, and weird fungal eggs that can be used to power repair torches and major mechanical upgrades. The line between the artificial world and the natural world is thinning, and nature is being poisoned by it. Once the border to the deep zone is crossed, the situation is absolutely dire. Very little grows. The radiation and the chaos has been at work for decades. The sheer impermanence of everything prevents nature from gaining any kind of foothold at all. Rocks, concrete, infrastructure, these things are in spectacular abundance at the expense of everything else. What makes the deep zone eerie is that this suggestion of an urban landscape is just a suggestion. There is no logic to any of it, no purpose. It is a vista of oppressive gray stone presented in an extremely abstract way. This is a place where nothing natural survives easily. You are equally as unwelcome as the plants. The Deep Zone is home to the last major resource, the cleverly named Olympium Stone. This miracle material is found glowing purple and iridescent in some of the many stone towers that sprout from the ground. The best technology requires the most decay and is only made possible by a more or less total usurpation of the Olympic Peninsula itself. It's a long fucking trip from the Outer Zone to the Deep Zone. Because you have to drive the route from terminus to terminus before opening up a big portal to zip home again, the game never fails to remind a player of this process of regional progressive degradation. It is always part of the experience, part of the mood, to shift from green to brown to gray, for the color and life to drain out and be replaced by a chaos that is only understandable as an unintended mistake, a consequence of Arda's greed. Pacific Drive is such a fascinating car game that way, because as much as it loves the station wagon, as much effort is spent getting the texture of that experience right, it is still fundamentally critical of the whole thing through the artistic frame and the symbolic storytelling. When we seek to transform, we often destroy, the moral of most any piece of environmentalist art. That's what's special about Pacific Drive. It has sympathy for the gas guzzlers of old. They were fun. They were beautiful in their boxy, lumbering way. But that doesn't excuse them or prevent them from being the charismatic villains of the story being told. What about the explicit story being told, though? How do you bolt a narrative onto something so completely driven by mechanical progression and vibes? The answer is simple and clever. You use the radio. Because it's reasonable to assume that a player will spend at least 5 to 10 minutes on a given map, that map can have 5 minutes of dialogue going on in the background of whatever activity the player happens to be doing. You're discovered by 2 former Arda employees when you start up the Remnant. They're shocked to find a car operating in the zone and immediately take an interest. Francis and Tobias are a great duo. One is soft-spoken and curious, artistic, and then the other is a very gregarious and social person. Their presence in the game is very soothing, a sympathetic, friendly pair of voices guiding a player through a very strange and confusing world. There is no dedicated antagonist in the game, but there is Dr. Ophelia Turner. She was one of the founding scientists at Arda. Her and her late husband were the ones who discovered LIM technology and caused the incident in the first place. The experiment going wrong killed her husband and left her deeply embittered. Oppie, as Tobias and Francis truthfully call her, seems at first to be utterly heartless, focused only on the science, willing to sacrifice anything for an answer. This is a front. As the game goes on, it becomes clear that she's externalizing her own pain, trying to be a kind of person so dispassionate that it might be possible to salvage some value from her husband's death and the destruction of such a beautiful place in the world. The balance of personalities works amazingly well. All 3 are supportive of the player's journey and progress, but in different ways, from different angles, with contrasting tones. All of them feel wonderfully human. Oppie particularly is a complex character, a person whose prickliness becomes a huge part of her charm. Because of the way the game is formatted, without these characters on screen at any time, these dialogues can be quite long. The player doesn't have to stand there and listen to them go around in a circle. This all plays out on top of the existing gameplay loops, adding interest to the base gameplay instead of pausing it. The dialogue continues whether in the car or out of it, the only difference being the quality of the sound. On foot you get a tinny earpiece quality, and in the car you get that big stereo sound. This contributes further to the mood with how a big part of road trips, for me anyway, is the soundscape as you're going along. Driving takes place on a deeper level in the brain than fully conscious thought. Once a person gets used to it, it becomes automatic, no more perceptible than moving your legs while walking. So driving, without any other stimulation, can be a little boring. Talk radio, or podcasts in more modern era, fill this gap really well. Time really flies by when you're splitting the focus this way. The rumble of the engine, the drone of the tires on pavement or crunching along on dirt and gravel, the voices on the radio. This is what simulates so well the sensory experience of road tripping. The dialogue between Oppie, Tobias, and Francis kind of splits the difference between the feeling of having on a talk radio station and the feeling of having company. It's social without having to participate in being social, which is a sensation I've often felt with road tripping, being kind of alone, but also very participatory in my environment by virtue of traveling through it, witnessing it, being part of the unknown place. More often than talk radio, I also love listening to music when driving. And that's where Pacific Drive shines especially bright. It has a long list of licensed music from real bands, but almost none of the tracks are familiar hits. Instead, the music is curated to fit with the setting, sometimes creepy, sometimes sarcastic, sometimes a little sentimental. Over the course of playing the game, I probably heard the entire playlist 20 times, and yet it didn't get old for me. I've gotten sick of Fallout's radio stations faster than I got sick of Pacific Drive's, and even then I just had to take a break for a couple of days, and then I was right back grooving along to it. It contributes to a feeling that even though the pieces are assembled in a procedurally generated way with Pacific Drive, each one of those pieces was crafted and selected with an incredible amount of deliberate care. Pacific Drive knows exactly what kind of mood it wants to project and how to get a player to live in that headspace. Simulating the mechanics of car ownership, that's hard. Simulating the sensations of long and winding road trips on the back byways, that's harder. But hardest of all, I think, is simulating the emotions that a road trip creates within a person. Pacific Drive excels at all three. There's a huge amount of additional background lore and world building done outside of the narrative dialogue in the form of a podcast and collectible documents. It's completely unpredictable how the documents will be distributed. They're found randomly in the back of trucks or inside of pneumatic storage tubes or stuffed inside of drawers in some research trailer. The podcast is particularly useful and interesting, but only appears rarely in the form of a map icon that looks like a cassette tape. Following the icon leads to an antenna tower where the audio log is stored. I'm not sure how many episodes there are in total. I got like 8 episodes deep and kept expecting it to wrap up, but it never did. The problem with it is that the mystery is incompatible with concrete, definitive answers, and the game knows it. So the whole investigative angle is all about drawing connections between things without ever completely giving away the whole. The investigator in the podcast, by virtue of being outside the zone, knows both more and less than you do as a player. Between that and all the many collectible documents, there are an overwhelming amount of details about the setting available, but because the nature of the zone is fundamentally surreal, none of it destroys the core sense of the thing being an enigmatic mess. The angle taken is to observe and document, not to crack it open and make it mundane. I feel like the real prize out there along the road are the car customization options: paint colors, decals, hood ornaments, charms to hang on the rearview mirror, antenna toppers, bumper stickers. All the shit that allows the Remnant to truly change in more ways than just the mechanical. As I progressed from the early game to middle game to end game, I had many different eras and styles of rig. There's a huge range of options for almost any taste, but since they are only found by exploring, you can't just pick what's perfect to you right away. The aesthetics of the machine, like its arc of progression, are metered so that the game still has surprises to give in the late hours of play. I was genuinely shocked with how many different kinds of looks I could coax out of the list of parts and paints. It's the kind of touch that really seals the deal when it comes to bonding with the machine. The Remnant is the only way to get around considering the scale of the maps, but it's also a crafting table, a Swiss Army knife of useful tools, a refuge from the hazards of the zone. It takes damage instead of you, more than you would ever survive, and in return, you must look after its care and feeding. A fair trade, really. The thing is, I didn't feel like I would be satisfied as a player finishing the game until the car was in its final form. All Olympium plating, limb-chipped engine, the works. So, knowing that the story was at its final chapter, I delayed actually playing the last mission for like 10 entire hours of deep zone runs. Did I need to do that? No. Did it help my review that I did that? Actually, as much as I would like to say to the contrary, no. The extra time was not full of new mechanics and new experiences. I had already seen the satellites that fall out of the sky if you linger past the point where the instability begins to close in on you in a zone. Because of the large pool of randomized elements, it's likely that I hadn't seen everything, but I had certainly seen enough to understand that the variations I had missed would be pretty small. I could have wrapped it up earlier. Except that the initial prophecy was true. I had driven myself to obsession over the Remnant, pulled deeper into the zone by pure automotomania. If I was going to get carried away, delaying the climax by longer than I probably should have was still ultimately the better way to go about it because Pacific Drive's climax is very effective. Spoilers for this section, I suppose, but every character goes through some sort of major emotional breakthrough. Those that are left. To get through to the deep zone at all, there has to be a sacrifice. While the player drives through gates in a kind of checkpoint challenge, a wave of unstable current follows them. Tobias then goes out into the instability and makes sure that the circuit connects at the cost of his own life. Francis and he had been together many years and loved each other very much. Things take a melancholy turn within the Deep Zone after their turn apart. It's a kind of mirror of what happened between Oppie and her husband at the beginning of all this mess. The final mission has the player driving through the well into the swirling energies that have consumed so much. This last sequence, from a mechanical perspective, is almost kind of a letdown. It's a linear foot maze through stacks of televisions. There's no puzzles, no danger. What it actually boils down to is that the developers had to create a tube long enough and twisty enough to last the entire length of the audio drama that plays on top of it. Here, in the non-linear world of jumbled time and jumbled ideas, there is still some fragment of both Alan and Tobias. Oppie has been living alone in a disaster zone all the way from 1961 to 1998, solely on the desperate hope that she would somehow find some trace of Alan. These reunions sound maybe a little over-sentimental just describing them, but the thing is that the length of time a player spends with these characters is really significant. There is a lot of dialogue in the game. These reunions are genuinely effectively sentimental because they have been adequately built up over long hours, because this really is the thing that Oppie needs to heal her whole spirit. And Francis is able to accept that Tobias is gone, allowing him to be jovial with you over the radio again. But soon after the climax, Oppie leaves the zone. Her penance is over, so it's only you and Francis after that point. And then there's the lore factor that, congratulations, you have severed the cursed bond you have with the station wagon, and now can, canonically, walk away yourself. So I did. I loved the mix of personalities, the sense of sharing the zone. The climax is so climactic that the zone, afterwards, feels kind of artificial and empty. It has always been kind of artificial and kind of empty, but that's the magic of dramatic presentation. It can feel like so much more than that. There is such a genuine and complete feeling of business being concluded after the main mission that if I had waited to upgrade the rig to my satisfaction, I would likely no longer want to. So I guess I did get the full experience that I wanted. With a game like this, so many randomized pieces, so many different kinds of players approaching it, wanting so many different things out of it, there is no real way to guarantee best outcomes for all those players. There is necessarily a kind of negotiation that has to happen where the player accepts a certain amount of confusion and frustration while they explore what's possible within the game world and how it all feels. For all the hours I put in, and all the hours I might not exactly have needed to put in, I was still making the choice proactively. I was here because I wanted to be. And because, when it comes to classic cars, impatience and frustration is paradoxically part of the joy. Pacific Drive is a true, genuine love letter to both the Pacific Northwest and the land yachts of old. And there are few things closer to my heart than those two things, making this such a peculiarly personal experience. It is many different layers of art, from landscape to audio design to dramatic performance, all working together, pistons pumping in harmony to power the big machine. But the car itself is never the whole point. The point is where it can take you, wandering far outside the ordinary on the winding, shifting roads at the edge of the headlight's beam. Thanks for watching.
force 100,000 people out of their homes without facing major resistance. Even if you're the United States government, facing down what's being peddled as the greatest threat our nation has ever faced, the answer is, you don't. This is Frequency File, Episode 3, The Human Cost. Last episode, I reported all the cold, hard facts I could get my hands on. If you missed that episode, here's the summary. There wasn't much. Now, we jump tracks to the stories of the people, to knit together old records and eyewitness accounts to form some fabric of the true story. Whoever's job it was at ARDA to suppress stories did a really good job. What they did to keep that